I'm Austin Asche, and I was born in Melbourne in 1925, or you could call that 1925 BC these days. I didn't stay in Melbourne very long because my father, who had graduated in law just before the Great War, then went to the war in Europe and indeed earned a military medal for bravery in the field. But what he also earned was a dose of gas which rather messed up his lungs and made him rather ill for most of his life. However, he came back after he was discharged. He worked in the Attorney General's Department of the Commonwealth, and he was sent up almost just after my birth to Rebel in New Guinea, because Rebel was then under a mandate to Australia. So I spent my first 2 years in Rebel. Of course, I don't remember anything about it, but my mother says that she thoroughly enjoyed it, and after a couple of years, my father was then directed to go to Darwin. So from Rebel, we went to Darwin, and as I say, I was about 2 years old when we got to Darwin, and Darwin was the place I grew up in. My father was appointed the Crown Law Officer for the Northern Territory, which meant that he did advise the government on legal matters and conducted the prosecutions on behalf of the Crown. So I grew up in Darwin, I think thoroughly enjoying it. It was a very small, very friendly place. I don't suppose there were more than about 1,000 people then, but we kids all sort of ran around the place. We didn't know what shoes were like, and I don't think we knew what a shirt was, but it was a very pleasant place. And when I got to about 4 or 5, I went to the Darwin Primary School, and we had I think a very good education there. And at one stage, I was taught by Mr. Tambling, who was the father of our Mr. Tambling, who was later a senator. Now, the trouble with schooling in Darwin was that primary school was the end of it. There were no high schools, there were no universities, obviously. And I think in our family, you only had to choose between being a doctor or being a lawyer, so I'd more or less chosen to be a lawyer. So they had to send me down south when I was about 8 or 9 to go to school down south. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, in about 2 years afterwards, there was what was called the Great Infantile Paralysis epidemic in Melbourne, and my mother in Darwin got so alarmed that she demanded that I and my sister come back to Darwin, which was not a bad idea as far as I was concerned. So we were put on the wonderful ship Morella, and we sailed from Melbourne to Darwin. This was the only way you could get to Darwin in those days. It took you 2 weeks, and so I arrived back to Darwin Primary. But by the time I'd reached 12 or 13, that was the end of Darwin Primary. I had to go back to Melbourne again. So I went to school in Melbourne, and I passed intermediate and leaving and whatever you passed in those days. And at the age of 18, I joined the Airforce. Now, I have to make it clear that I'm no great hero. By the time I joined the Air Force, I'd just turned 18, and in January 1944, the Japanese had ceased bombing Darwin, and we were starting to bomb them. However, I joined the Air Force hoping to be a glamorous fighter pilot, naturally, but the Air Force took one look at my eyesight and decided that wasn't for me. So they offered me a few different choices, and radar operator sounded in those days rather mysterious, and so we got on to that. So I became a radar operator. We trained at Shepparton for three weeks at an ordinary drill and that sort of thing, just learning to march, and that was perfectly all right for me, because I had been a sergeant in the military cadets and also a sergeant in the Air Training Corps. So I did my drill, which was just as well, because at my height I was appointed marker, and as you know, a marker of a squad is the one everybody else follows. If the marker makes a mistake, the whole squad makes a mistake. So I was lucky because I knew my drill, but my friend, who was about the same height as me, was the marker for the next squad, and he didn't know anything. And you could hear the sergeant screaming hell out of him every now and again. So we spent our 3 weeks in Shepparton, and then they shot me off to Wilson's Promontory, which had a radar station there. And that gave me preliminary training in how to operate, how to be a radar operator. And then came the posting to Darwin, which of course was, for me, was absolutely marvellous. Back to the old hometown. So we got up to Darwin we went by train from Melbourne to Adelaide, then changed gauges from Adelaide to Tarowie, and from Tarowie we got onto buses, and they took us for about 3 or 4 days up to Larimer, which was the end of the row line from Darwin to Larimer. And we got there into cattle trucks, and I think they'd hosed the cattle out reasonably well. It wasn't too uncomfortable. And we got to Darwin. I only spent a few days in Darwin, but what was interesting from my point of view is that coming from Darwin, which had been a small town, I suddenly got back to a place where there were thousands of men everywhere, because the whole, so many troops were up there, and there were Americans as well as Australians, and so wherever you went, you met crowds, and that was very surprising to me. However, within a few days, they'd posted me out to Montlevet Island, which is a tiny island, 2.5 miles long by 1/2 mile wide, right at the top of West Australia, at the top of the Bonaparte Peninsula. And as you probably know, by that time, Australia was ringed by radar stations all around the coast. And the purpose of radar stations was to detect incoming aircraft and, of course, follow outgoing aircraft. Since they were about, say, 100 miles out, they could then send their reports to headquarters on the mainland, and headquarters could then know where the plane was coming from, what speed and what sort of plane it was, and they could be then send up the fighter pilots if necessary and things like that. So radar stations were all fairly isolated, but Montlevet was a pretty good spot. I suppose it was pretty crude in the sense that, you know, there's an old joke about a recruit coming into the army and says, the sergeant says, can you make a bed? And the group says, yeah, I can make a bed. So a sergeant hands him a hammer and nails and saw it, and we'll go and make one. Well, that was exactly what we had to do in Montlevet. We just had to go and chop down a few trees and make a bed and put some hessian across it, and that was it. The point of that was that you had to stand the legs of the bed in tins or some oil, because otherwise the centipedes got up. And they were very big centipedes, and I can assure you that having a centipede in bed with you is not a very pleasant experience. So we had to keep that off. Otherwise we had snakes, but they weren't, they were pretty shy, we didn't see many, but lots and lots of lizards. You could become friendly with a lizard. You could sort of feed it a few flies or two, and some of the boys used to talk to the lizards. The idea was that if you talked to you, that was all right, but if the lizard talked back to you, it was time to go to the mainland. So there I spent 7 or 8 months. The Duva, that is the machinery which ran the radar, which ran the aerial, was about 3/4 of a mile from the camp, and you had to walk up the camp, and then as a radar, you had to have, the set had to be operated 24 hours a day, of course, so we had various groups who we might spend 6 hours in the morning, and then a day later 6 hours at night, or so on. There were about 8 radar operators, and then the aristocrats of the camp were the radar mechanics, because they were radio mechanics, and then they graduated to radar, and they knew all about it, and they kept the Duva running and kept everything going well, and they were great blokes. And then you had we had the usual cook and other people. We had about 10 guards, which seems a bit strange these days, but they were supposed to look after the camp if it was ever attacked, and they were good blokes. They, for some reason, we radar ops were young fellows. We had 18 or 19. The guards in this particular camp, at any rate, had mostly come from West Australia, and they were West Australian miners, and they were in the late 20s or 30s. So they were good blokes, but there was a gap between us. And I mean, they felt we were very young fellows, and we felt they were pretty old fellows. But we got on all right. But we had it was an interesting life. But what you were doing, you were sending out signals from your aerial. The aerial went round 360 degrees. Now the signals went out, and anything hitting the signals would send a signal back. So what you got on the cathode ray tube was the signal back, which showed you, the array tube was modulated, which showed you how far away the object was in the air. Then you manoeuvred the aerial to see what angle it was coming at. And then if you got a couple of shots, and shots were little blips on the radar, and they were, you sort of learnt how to pick them up quickly. If you got enough of those, you could estimate the speed. So while one of you worked in a team of 2, one of you was on the Duva sending this information back to the other one who had a great map in front of him. And the map was coordinated, and he, from what you told him on the Duva, he would locate the aircraft and its position on the map. And then the third member of the team was the radio operator. He sent all that back to headquarters, and headquarters then knew what was coming in. And of course, headquarters were another 100 miles away, so they had about say 150 miles warning between a plane coming in. It may not sound much these days, but planes weren't as quick as they are now. So we spent time on that, and we had beautiful beaches. So we did a lot of swimming. About the only time I was in any danger was, I was a terrible skite, and I used to swim further out than anybody else just to show off. And I was doing that one day, and I saw what appeared to be a floating log, but it turned out to be a floating crocodile. So I made a sort of record burst back to the shore where my friends had been waiting and yelling out to me, trying to get me. So that was the nearest I came to any great danger. The only time I was ever in any great personal danger after that was on one occasion when I was helping to load the weekly supply of beer, and I dropped a case which broke about 3 or 4 bottles. And since our beer ration was 2 bottles a week, it caused a certain amount of dissent amongst my mates. However, they were very kind to me. We had one of our friends was a teetotaler, so we always got his bottles. About 8 months on Montlevet, and then they decided to transfer us. So they transferred us back to Bathurst Island, and the interesting thing there was a much more luxurious radar set, because in Montlevet it was what was called a lightweight set, and you had to provide the motion by your own efforts. In other words, you had to turn a handle which turned you around 360 degrees, and you had to keep doing it. When we got to Bathurst, this was all done mechanically, so you just press a button and all you did was watch the Duva. So it was, again, a very pleasant spot, and again, a lovely beach. Apparently there were crocodiles. I just didn't think about them just as well, perhaps. I've been told that there were crocodiles there, but we never saw them. And we had a lot of... and of course we did a bit of fishing, and how you fished there was you took out a boat. We had a little rowing boat, and you where the sergeant came up with a little bit of gunpowder, and when we got out fair enough, he threw some sort of bomb into the water which exploded. The swimmers, such as myself, then jumped out and picked up the fish who were, by this time, they weren't dead, but they were stunned, so he threw them into the boat, and he went back and got a good fish feed, which was a bit of a relief from what they usually got, which was tinned bully beef or tinned sausages, which were not bad, but it gets a bit monotonous. So we spent some time there. Of course, at this stage, I was convinced, and I think everyone was convinced, that the war was going to go on for a long time. We knew about victory in Europe, but the Japanese were dug in. It was clear that they were going to take years to get them out, and we were preparing for a long war. But then, of course, the atom bomb was dropped, and things changed overnight. Oh, I think it was a terrific surprise to everyone. As I say, we'd all settled down to the idea that we'd be 3 or 4 more years in the Air Force, and it was a surprise, but I think we got the idea pretty quickly that the war really was over, and we had. The interesting thing about I like to tell people, though I'm sure you'd understand anyway, that there was never during the war any suggestion anywhere in Australia that we should come to some peace terms of any sort. I think there was never a country more united in the idea that we're going to win this war, and there was no suggestion of any defeatism. We knew that after all, the Darwin bombing was pretty severe, and there were many, many more raids, but there was never any sense of defeatism in the Australian public. They were terrific. So I got back to the University of Melbourne, and I did an arts course and a law course, and I then decided that I'd practice law in Queensland because, again, I wanted to get further north, and it wasn't any use going to Darwin in those days because I wanted to be a barrister. As a solicitor, it would have been all right, but as a barrister, normally are with a whole lot of other barristers, and so the closest I could come was Brisbane. So I spent 3 years in Brisbane learning as the trade, as it were, and but I found that whenever I came back to Melbourne, things were much busier in Melbourne. Brisbane took off some years later, and they've been a great bar now. But so I got back to Melbourne and started, well, the usual barrister, starting in the magistrates' courts and moving up to the county court and moving up to the Supreme Court, the usual business. And after many years, I decided I could take silk, that has become a QC, and I became a QC, and I'd become rather an expert in what's the old divorce law now, but it was quite a complicated law in those days. But then so as a QC, I was then put back into a lot of criminal matters again, and that was a great help later on. So after a period, the family court started up in 1976, and I was appointed the first judge in Victoria. And I spent the next 10 years as a judge of the family court, and as a senior judge I did a lot of appeal work, that is, you were 3 judges on appeal, and that meant travelling to other capitals because the family court was a federal court. So I had a very interesting time. You'd spend a fortnight in Perth, a fortnight in Adelaide, a fortnight in Brisbane and so on, and you'd get to know the bar there, and you'd get to know the judges there, and there was a slightly different technique in each bar had their own sort of local technique of presenting things, and it was a very interesting time. And the one place that the family court hadn't set up a permanent judge was Darwin, because they didn't consider the expense was warranted. But the idea was to send up a judge from the south, say once every 6 months or so. And being a fairly senior judge, I made it perfectly clear that if any judge was going to be up to Darwin, it was going to be me. So while I was 10 years in the family court, I did get a number of trips to Darwin as a judge of the family court. And then finally came that wonderful day when I got this marvellous phone call. Could I come up to be a Supreme Court judge in Darwin? And I said, well, just give me a couple of nanoseconds, and up I went. And I came up to my hometown and found it was just as wonderful and friendly as it always had been, and so I settled in and never wanted to leave again. Oh, I should have mentioned that I did have this because this had some bearing on the fact that I was connected with the Northern Territory University. I think I must be one of the few people who've been Chancellor of 2 universities, but I really could say almost Chancellor of 3, because I was President of RMIT before it became a university. Then I became Chancellor of Deakin University, which is in Geelong. And then, as I was appointed to a judge in the Territory, I was asked to be Chancellor of the Northern Territory University, which has now become Charles Darwin University. So I had that interest as well, and it was very fascinating to see the Northern Territory University grow into the university it is now. And it's, of course, a university with absolutely enormous potential, because it stretches out to the Asian market, and we have wonderful Asian students. So I think it will be the most important university in Australia in about 70 or 80 years. So there I was in the as a judge of the Supreme Court, and then our Chief Justice retired, and they made me Chief Justice. And then they came along a few years later and asked me to be administrator. So I became administrator, which was quite interesting because I went to Government House. Now, when I was a little boy, our house was not far from Government House, and I used to toddle up at the age of 4 or 5 and play with the administrator's daughter, who was about 6 or 7. So we had a friendship there. So it was not unfamiliar to me, but very interesting to come back to a house. It's a lovely old house, and so we had a great time there as administrator. And you get around. As the one thing I said to them when they said to be administrators, well, look, I'm administrator of the territory, I'm not administrator of Darwin. So I did make sure, all other administrators do it, that I got around the territory, particularly Alice Springs, of course, because that's very important. The second, I better not say this, the Alice Springs people won't like it, but shall we say, the less inhabited city, but the biggest after Darwin. And so I used to get down to Alice Springs, which is a wonderful, wonderful place. And of course, the only thing that surprised me was how cold Alice Springs could be in the winter. It was extraordinarily cold. Of course, it gets very hot in the summer. But it's it's a wonderful and exciting place, and it's got a remarkable future because it really should be the capital of Australia. It's the centre. Every other capital is close by. So, and one day maybe one day it will, though I don't know whether Canberra people are terribly keen on that idea. So we got to Alice Springs, and we got to Tennant Creek, and we got to various other parts, Nhulunbuy, and also a lot of Aboriginal communities. Great people all around, wonderful people, and it was a wonderful experience. And I was very grateful that I had the opportunity. When I got back to Melbourne and after Brisbane, I was moving up in the bar, and I became. I'd gone to Trinity College, one of the university colleges of Melbourne, and after I left Trinity College, I became a tutor there, so tutoring law. Now, and you didn't meet of course there were tutors in medicine and dentistry and commerce and all the rest of it. So you didn't meet the other tutors, except once a year when the warden of Trinity threw a party for the tutors. So I had attended those parties, and one year I attended, and I saw the most beautiful girl in the world. And on inquiry, I found that she was a tutor in microbiology, and she was also a first-class student and a lecturer, and she had everything. So I had a word with her that night. We arranged a meeting the next day, and I proposed. And she was a bit hesitant, but I was fairly confident. And so we went out the third day, and I proposed again, and she accepted. And she was the most beautiful girl in the world. She's the most wonderful wife, and we had the most wonderful life together. I can assure you that I was enormously grateful. And we had 2 wonderful children. So, and of course, she had a good a job in Melbourne at a hospital looking after the microbiological side. When I told her she knew I wanted to go to Darwin anyway. When I told her I wanted to go to Darwin, she said, "All right, she knew I wanted to. She followed me up and she found fortunately, Menzies School of Health had just become established in Darwin, and she found a very good job there. So we were both happy, and we both came to love Darwin. I think she still had a yearning for her country town called Rapanium, which is a little country town in Victoria where she came from. But she was a country girl in that way, but one of the cleverest and most learned women in her field also. So it was the greatest gift that ever happened to me was this absolutely wonderful woman. Sadly, we lost her a year ago, but at least she went very peacefully without any pain or any problems. Apart from that, I've been well looked after by my children, and Wendy makes me very lazy because she anticipates everything I want and does it for me. So here I am, relaxed, far too old, but reading enormously and quite enjoying things. So I think it's time I went. But well, I was a patron of the RSL, but I told them recently that I'm getting a bit old, and a patron has to do certain things, and I should get another one. But of course, I've always admired the RSL. I think they're a wonderful movement that have kept Australia steady throughout the generations. And they keep up the idea of mateship and what it is to be an Australian and how to be proud of your country. And they're a great institution. And I was very proud to be their patron, and I still, of course, see them many times. It's a very good ceremony. It's out. We would have a ceremony, and then we'd march, and for a few years, until I got too feeble, I used to march with them. I used to enjoy being part of the march, and we go to the RSL. Unfortunately, that place were burnt down last year, but sadly. But you'd go to the RSL and you'd have a beer, and the whole crowd of people in it. It was just a friendly reception, and just the sort of thing you'd expect the RSL to be. Very friendly and lively, and so we'd have a few beers and go home. And we also celebrate Remembrance Day and various others. It's very kind of the Royal Artillery Association. I've done a lot for Darwin in the Darwin Military Museum, and it's a splendid place to see. And if you want to know something about the Darwin in the wartime, it's a wonderful spot. But they've also got many other things to look at. Oh well, Vietnam veterans, I've always admired them because they had a very bad time. And I mean, it was disgraceful. It was only a few people, I will say, but some came back and were abused. They'd gone to Vietnam to serve their country, and they, incidentally, had served it very well. They were in good order when they left, and they had performed very well in the activities, and they were a splendid group. But I mean, I found it appalling. And one of them told me he went into a bar, and he was talking to the barmaid, and she said, "What are you doing?" She said, "I've just come back from Vietnam," and she threw a glass of beer at his face. It was absolutely... well, at any rate, I'm highly sympathetic and admiring of the Vietnam vets, and I'm very proud that they made me patron. and they're a very good crowd in a very good mob in Darwin. I know some people don't agree with this, but I think we really should have compulsory military service for children, for people between the ages of 18 and 20, for two reasons. One, to get them proper training in some particular military skill, but more importantly, to introduce themselves to fellow Australians. That was the great thing I found in the Air Force. I met fellow Australians all over the place, and they were terrific. When any Aussie, you were almost immediately a friend, and it's something very, very particular, very, very wonderful about being an Australian. So I think we have to make sure that our younger people get that feeling of being part of a great country and being loyal to that country. Also, I don't mind I think Singapore, I believe, has a system whereby if you have a conscientious objection to serving, and we're a democratic society, we should allow that, then serve in social services for 2 years. And you could look after old people, serve in hospitals, do something to serve your country for a couple of years. Yes, my mother was intensely patriotic. In fact, it was always a family joke that after the war, if any strange man was being introduced to the household, her first question was, "Did he go to the war?" And if he didn't, he had to have a very good explanation why he didn't go to the war. And I think I always thought that one of the reasons she married my father was because he had a military medal. But she was a wonderful lady, because when my father died, he died without any penniless, and she had to bring up 5 children, and she went out to work herself and brought up the 5 children very well, and they've all done well, and we're scattered about. My brother has 9 children, and his second daughter has 8, and of those she has already 2 grandchildren and 4 on the way, so so we're doing well. One thing that was very much in my life and my eldest sister was the travelling from Melbourne to Darwin by ship, because we travelled in a wonderful ship. It was in fact built in Germany during the 1418 war, and I am told it was correct that it was built for the Kaiser. The idea was that when Germany had conquered all the world, the Kaiser would go around in this ship and visit all the Australians run his rule and the Canadians run his rule. Well, it didn't quite turn out like that, but the ship was beautifully built, and it was taken by Burns Phillip, an Australian shipping company, as war reparation. And it travelled from Adelaide to Port Moresby. And if you boarded the ship at Melbourne, it took you 2 weeks to get to Darwin, and really was the only way to get to Darwin. So, we were put on when I was about, I suppose 11, and my sister 9 or so. We were put on the ship in Melbourne in charge of the stewardess and told we'd go to Darwin. And of course we took over the ship. It was a very comfortable ship, and we used to stay 2 days in Sydney, 2 days in Brisbane, 1 day in Thursday Island, and it was and we were of course always joined by other children coming from Sydney or Brisbane and going back to Darwin. So we virtually ran the ship, and it was a splendid fortnight of visiting cities we hadn't visited before. Of course, we were only young, and meeting old friends. and tearing up and down the ship and making a nuisance of ourselves. And there was always there were two decks where the passengers could sit out, and there was all afternoon and morning tea. Somebody came along with ice creams, so of course we'd go onto the first deck and help us up to ice creams, and then scream down to the second deck to get the second lot of ice creams and things like that. But it was great fun, and I suppose that we did it several times, and I don't think I've ever been more comfortable. We didn't get the news that Melbourne and Sydney got. We didn't have papers. But I don't think we were supposed to have radios. But hell, we had the mechanics, and they were top class radio mechanics and top class radar mechanics. So if anyone could build a radio, they could. I'm not so sure sometimes where they got some of the equipment, but we would hear the news that way. And the one thing we enjoyed very much was Tokyo Rose. Now, if the Japanese thought that Tokyo Rose was going to convert any Australians, they must have been crazy. But we enjoyed Tokyo Rose. She'd talk about the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was Japanese occupied. I don't know whether the people in the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere were entirely delighted with the Japanese, but there it was. And then she'd say, "Oh, you boys in the north, you know that the American boys are getting at your girlfriends in Melbourne and Sydney while you're up here in the north." It was great fun. I believe they did arrest her as a war criminal when they took over Jibba, but I hope they treated her kindly. She didn't really deserve anything, anything bad. Part of the excitement of Darwin, of course, was in the early days when I was a kid, was that aviation was just sort of coming into the fore. And we saw some of the great aviators land in Darwin. For instance, I was I'm not saying I was old enough to see Ross and Keith Smith land in 1919, but I did see what would happen was we'd hear that the plane was coming in, and all Darwin, which meant about 800 people, would congregate at the, what was it, you would call it aerodrome. It's really just a straight, and we'd wait, and now Kingsford Smith and Hinkler, I'm sure I saw, but I don't remember very much. I do remember Amy Johnson coming down and wondering what such a tiny plane it was, how she'd got all the way from England, this tiny plane. But the great thing about that is that, as you know, in the 20s and early 30s, Australia dominated air exploration. They were the great aviators, and they made a great name. Of course, it was a dangerous practice. Ross Smith was killed. Kingsford Smith was ultimately lost. Ulm was lost. Hinkler, all the great fellows, all the great airmen, they paid with their lives, but they were wonderful, marvellous people, wonderful Australians. One, of course, is a happy marriage. Obviously, you know, being involved in the family law situation for me, all very sad to see some of these marital breakups. But it was better in many cases. Most cases, it was better they broke up than stayed on and got worse and worse. But no, I think the only thing about law, it's useless to talk about a philosophy of life. You just pick it up as it goes along. But I suppose the interesting thing is to remember that the worst probably won't happen, and the best probably won't happen. So most of the time, you can fiddle around in between, and if you can relax about that, then things are fairly good for you. And of course, health is the important thing there. I mean, if you became ill, it's a very different life, and I feel always very great sympathy for those who have gone through life with a lot of illness.